The United States won World War 2.5, but who lost? This is Andrew Stotz of the Become a Better Investor community. Let's get started. Remember, this information is for educational purposes only. This is not investment advice or a recommendation. So, World War 2.5, it was the U.S. against who? Who do you think? I would argue it was U.S. against Europe, and I'm going to try to explain why I say that in this presentation. So, the Russia-Ukraine conflict gave the U.S. an opportunity to dominate Europe. Militarily, almost all European countries joined NATO, and the U.S. controls NATO. Politically, the weakening of Germany means there's now no dominant power in the EU. Culturally, well, U.S.-Russia showdown is destabilizing Europe through immigration. Whether you're pro or against immigration, there is a destabilizing factor when you have a volume of people coming into your country. Financial, all EU countries exist within the US dollar framework and are unable to exit. One great example was when Trump got out of the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal, and Europe still wanted to trade with Iran, but they couldn't. Energy, the US cut the flow of Russian oil and gas, which weakens Europe. So let's look at this. Let's look at the military dominance. First, the U.S. has more than 60,000 troops in Europe, half of which are in Germany and a third of which are in Italy and in the U.K. This chart is thanks to Al Jazeera's excellent. And the U.S. operates more than 200 military bases in Europe. The U.S. can use Europe now as a staging position to, therefore, fight off Russia or anyone else. Now, some people say that it is Russia or China that are trying to dominate the world militarily. And I think that the next chart that I show you will help you to understand that maybe that's not as true as it seems. Here we can see there's 750 U.S. bases in 80 countries. In fact, there's 173,000 U.S. troops deployed in 159 countries. Basically, America is everywhere and has the ultimate military dominance, including the controls of the seas, both the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. And we can see here that NATO in blue is pushing in on Russia. In fact, Sweden and Finland are attempting to join NATO. And we can see, if we go back to 2008, there was a NATO meeting that happened in April of 2008, where the U.S. administration pushed the NATO members to announce that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO. It was said at the time that Merkel and Sarkozy, the head of France at the time, were against this, but they couldn't resist the U.S. pressures. Immediately after that April 2008 meeting, what we could see was that Russia immediately responded to say that would be a red line if NATO expand onto the borders of Russia. And as a result, in August of 2008, we saw that Putin invaded Georgia, or a portion of Georgia, to attempt to stop Georgia from considering joining NATO. He was successful in that, and it gave a premonition of what he could potentially do with Ukraine. Part of this is why also the U.S. worked hard in 2014 to try to influence as much as they could the Ukrainian government so that the U.S. could have control, so that when Putin decided that he would not allow Ukraine to come onto the border of, join NATO, and therefore NATO be on the border of Russia, that the U.S. was positioned to handle that. Now, NATO membership means Europeans participate as peacekeepers in U.S. conflicts. Well, we know about peacekeeping. In Kuwait and Iraq in 1990, they were involved in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992, in Kosovo in 1999, in Afghanistan in 2003, in Iraq in 2004, Somalia 2009, and Libya in 2011. Now let's talk about political dominance. Here we can see a meeting between Trump and Stoltenberg, the head of NATO. And Trump is basically explaining that, hey, you're dependent on Russia now for your oil, and we are protecting you. We're spending all this money on NATO to protect you from Russia, yet you're doing this deal. Ultimately, what you'll see is that Trump, as well as prior and next administrations, basically want Europe to cut ties to Russia. Let's listen in.
But Germany is totally controlled by Russia because they were getting from 60 to 70% of their energy from Russia and a new pipeline. And you tell me if that's appropriate, because I think it's not. And I think it's a very bad thing for NATO, and I don't think it should have happened. And I think we have to talk to Germany about it.
NATO is an alliance of 29 nations, and there are sometimes differences and different views and also some disagreements. And the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany is one issue where allies disagree. But the strength of NATO is that despite these differences, we have always been able to unite around our core task to protect and defend each other, because we understand that we are stronger together than apart.
But Germany, as far as I'm concerned, is captive to Russia because it's getting so much of its energy from Russia. So we're supposed to protect Germany, but they're getting their energy from Russia. Explain that. And it can't be explained, you know that.
So you can see from this that the U.S. wants that pipeline, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, to be terminated. Now, the absence of Angela Merkel and her coalition's political leadership in Europe has allowed the U.S. to fill that gap, for example, forcing Germany to cut off Russian oil and gas supply. European political leaders will find it hard to oppose the U.S. Nord Stream 2 was meant to deliver as much as 70% of Germany's gas needs, and Germany exited nuclear power in 2011 and coal-fired power in 2019. So they didn't make things easier for themselves on those actions in Germany. Now here is the CEO of Germany's biggest gas and electricity provider, who said it is utopian to believe that Russian gas can be completely replaced from one day to the next by other sources. Let's look at cultural dominance. This chart is an excellent chart that shows us, I think it's from the BBC, it shows us the influx of migrant into Europe in the 2015 crisis. And basically what we can see is the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis saw nearly 1.3 million people arrive in Europe to request asylum. That's the most in a single year since World War II. And it's not just Syrians, but also Afghans and Nigerians and others. And this was ultimately driven by conflicts that America initiated in different parts of Africa, in particular Syria, or the Middle East. So of the asylum seekers from the Syrian crisis, refugees came from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia. 51% went to Germany, 10% went to France, 9% went to Italy, and 7% went to Sweden. But now, let's look at what's happening here. Since February of 2022, more than 11 million Ukrainians have entered the European Union. You could say Ukraine entered the European Union. Countries that receive these refugees are 29% Germany, Czech Republic 14%, Bulgaria 10%. Now, I'm not arguing against receiving these refugees, but what I'm saying is that bringing in a huge volume of people into your country or into the region of Europe is a destabilizing force. And also, of course, some of these will go back to Ukraine when things are resolved, but many of them will stay. And there's competition for jobs and other things that can happen. Let's look at financial dominance for a moment. Here we can see that if we look at the Americas, the U.S. is absolutely dominant force. If we look at Asia, China is an absolutely dominant force, with GDP being 19% of the total GDP of the world. And here we can see that in Europe, it's almost equal, right? Germany, in fact, getting knocked down in 2022 as a result of energy issues there. So unlike the Americas and Asia, no country is a dominant force in Europe. And Merkel's strong political leadership is gone with nothing to replace it. And Germany's economy is weakened very much from this crisis. So also, let's look at financial dominance relative to SWIFT. SWIFT was founded in 1973 and connects 11,000 banks and organizations in over 200 countries. It's an instant messaging system that notifies users when payments are transferred and received. Now, the U.S. forced other SWIFT members to exclude Russia, and they did the same against Iran in the past. And basically, European banks and European companies had to follow what U.S. said. U.S. now has a very potent weapon in the U.S. dollar system, and this is part of the reason why what's happening is the U.S. administration is ultimately hastening the development of an alternative system. So there's the cross-border interbank payment system, which was set up in 2015 as a settlement and payment clearing system for transactions that use the Chinese yuan. And it was supervised by China's central bank. And SWIFT is a messaging system, whereas CHIPS, this cross-border interbank payment system, is a settlement system for renminbi transactions that also offers some communication functions. Now, the U.S. is pushing Russia and other 9 non-aligned countries into the arms of the Chinese, and ultimately, there's going to be some alternatives coming out. Next is dominance in energy. Now, China, U.S., and India are the top 3 energy consumers. I've tried to break down energy consumption using this British Petroleum statistical review. This is of 2021. We can see that China has consumption of 26% of total energy, U.S. 16%, and India at 6%. And basically what we can see is both China and India are going to see theirs increase over time. So 82% of world energy consumption comes from fossil fuels. Europe is at 71%. Nuclear helps in Europe, particularly in France. In fact, there are countries such as Norway where only 27% of energy comes from fossil fuels, Sweden 29%, Finland 47%, Switzerland 47%, France 50%, Brazil 53%. Now, in this table, the renewables are mainly wind and solar. Now, the U.S., what I looked at here is the top countries on production of both oil and gas. And we can see that the U.S. has about 18.5% of total production, and that Russia is number 2, and Saudi Arabia is also basically tied at 2. Now, the U.S. just knocked out one of its main competitors for the European energy demand. Boom, Russia's out. And a while ago, they tried to knock out Iran exporting into Europe. So Europe is stuck either buying U.S. or Saudi Arabian oil and gas. So let's take a look at this in more detail. Russia is really the heart of European energy sources. This is an excellent map that comes from National Geographic, and what it shows is the arteries of distribution of oil and gas. Now, the oil, sorry, I just got to get closer here. The oil pipeline is the red, and the gas pipeline is the green. But basically, you can see it's a massive amount of production that's happening in about the center of Russia that's then being shipped into Europe. There is no other major supply of energy in Europe except Russia. And here we can see, I put this on to kind of see that it really is the heart of energy for Europe. Now, the U.S. has forced Europe to ban oil and gas imports from Iran since 2018 U.S. sanctions, and Germany succumbed to U.S. pressure to cut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Basically, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz halted the approval process for Nord Stream 2, and they said they'll reassess. However, something changed. We'll talk about that in a second. The U.S. has started to substitute 10% of Russian gas supply to Europe, but Europe doesn't really have a great infrastructure for receiving and distributing that natural gas, except the pipelines coming from Russia. So here we can see the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the disaster that happened with Nord Stream 2. Andrew Baxter, the director of energy transition at the Environmental Defense Fund, estimated that 115,000 tons of methane was released, and that the impact was equivalent to the annual carbon emission from 2 million cars. It's out of control, the amount of damage that the Nord Stream 2 blowup did. Who did that? Well, we'll look at that. But here we can see that Russia is really the supply. Now, in this particular chart, you can see a production indicator above 100% demonstrates the ability to export. So the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, has a massive ability to export, and also the Middle East has a massive ability to export. But America produces a lot of gas, but it also consumes a lot of production of both gas and oil, and therefore there's not a huge amount of capacity for the U.S. to export, and therefore you can also see that cutting off the energy supply of Russia seems to have been a very, very powerful thing for the U.S. to do. And the U.S. didn't do it. They encouraged Europe to do it itself. So what have you learned in this? Well, almost all European countries joined NATO, and the U.S. controls NATO. And the weakening of Germany leaves Europe with no dominant political power to challenge the U.S. The U.S.-Russia showdown is destabilizing Europe through immigration, and all EU countries exist within the U.S. dollar framework and are unable to exit, and the U.S. cut the flow of Russian oil and gas, which weakens Europe. The bottom line, the United States won World War 2.5. Europe willingly lost without a drop of blood being spilled.